The year is 1996, and you have just received word of the release of the Nintendo 64. You cast aside your old Super Nintendo, and you get your cash ready to purchase yourself the next big console, released from Nintendo. On your way to your local game store, you come across a psychological conflict. Which of the three biggest fifth-generation consoles are truly worth spending your money on? Surely you've been a Nintendo fan since you got the Nintendo Entertainment System. However, your friends have purchased Sony's new console, the PlayStation, and you don't want to be left alone. What's up, everyone? Today I wanted to look back at the history of the compelling console wars that have been ongoing since the dawn of the first generation of home consoles. I want to take a look back at the 90s with the launch of the first PlayStation battling against the long-awaited Nintendo 64, and of course, the biggest competitor Nintendo had at the time, Sega. First, let's look at the Sega Saturn, which launched in November of 1994. Following the release of Sega's last major home console, the Genesis, many fans looked forward to the Saturn's launch. After all, Genesis was a major competitor to the Super Nintendo. Of course, there was the release of the Game Gear, which competed against Nintendo's Game Boy, but I think we can all agree who the true victor of that competition was. Anyways, getting off topic, Saturn was finally released, being sold for a whopping $399. Seems like a fair price for the Saturn. There was promising launch titles coming along with the Saturn. Some include Panzer Dragoon and Daytona USA. The reason I believe the Saturn didn't do as well as Sega had hoped was lack of evolution of the company's consoles. The Saturn just came out too late after the Genesis, and besides the Game Gear being a flop, there was already a 32X and CD player that released that didn't do Sega any more favors. The Saturn made an advance to a CD-based system, one of the biggest shifts in gaming at the time. The Saturn was also the first console to have a web browser powered by Netlink modem. It allowed users to use any dial-up they wanted. Sega expanded the RAM capacity of the Saturn's cartridges. With only a few titles of such cartridges, they did allow up to 4 megabytes of RAM. Sega also released arcade joystick controllers for the Saturn, which are mainly hated by gamers worldwide. Up next is the Sony PlayStation, which launched in December of 1994. The PlayStation was priced at $299 USD, which overall made it a better gift for your kids or yourself for the holiday season. Sony had previously attempted a deal with Nintendo to develop a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo to help advance to CDs over cartridges. The PlayStation had a series of launch titles under its belt, some including Air Combat, NBA Jam Tournament, and Rayman. With perfect timing on the release of the PlayStation, Sony had an upper hand in sales and getting their foot in the door. Sony revolutionized a lot of game genres. Racing games were heavily popular on the PlayStation, and it also had brought in a lot of RPG titles to explore, which competed heavily with the N64. Unfortunately, a major flaw of the beloved PlayStation is that it originally had only 2 megabytes of RAM in memory. The PlayStation's hardware was easy to design for, and therefore textures looked a lot more realistic. Thirdly is the N64. The console Nintendo fans have been waiting for since its teasing all the way back in 1993 as Project Reality. The N64 was meant to launch in 1995, however, due to issues with launch titles, the N64 was pushed back a year. The N64 launched with titles including Super Mario 64, Pilot Wing 64, and Donkey Kong 64. Nintendo was not only evolving graphics, but they were also evolving in console design and controller design. However, the PlayStation had an overall better controller than the N64, easily making the PlayStation Nintendo's biggest competitor for the N64. The N64 was the cheapest of the three consoles, only being sold for $199 USA. Nintendo was ahead of the game with their console lineup and fan base. It seemed Nintendo would be easily matching up against the PlayStation. Now, Nintendo's 64 features a wide library of games for all players to enjoy, tons of different titles to discover, and one of the great things that N64 did was making 4-player multiplayer a standard. Of course, the PlayStation players could obtain the same with multi-tap, but most of the games were compatible with only 2 players. The N64 was also capable of linking to the Game Boy for owners of the portable console. Not only that, but the expansion pack, which adds an extra 4 megabytes of RAM. The battle between the N64 and PlayStation was so huge, it left next to no room for the poor Saturn to popularize. Don't get me wrong, the Saturn did a lot of cool things by itself, but compared to the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation, the Saturn is just easily ignored. Both the PlayStation and N64 had huge titles to explore, and made it a hard choice to choose between the two consoles. Obviously, Nintendo fans would go to pick up the N64, given it was so innovative for Nintendo, but it's easy to see why players might pick up a Sony PlayStation as well.